My grandmother held me down while they burned my chest with a pestle to keep the men away. When I asked if she ever felt sorry, she scoffed and said, "Regret is a luxury for women who raised failures." I stayed silent. That was 4 months ago. Yesterday, she saw my face on the evening news and dropped the pestle mid-sentence. In my family, every girl who started puberty had to go through the flattening. It didn't matter if you were 10, 11, or 12. The moment your chest showed any sign of puberty meant you were ready for the hot stones sizzling on your skin. Growing up, I thought it was just something all girls went through, like losing baby teeth, until I turned 11, because that's when I watched my sister Adana scream for 3 hours straight as they pressed the grinding stone against her chest. They heated it on the cooking fire first until it glowed, then wrapped it in a thin cloth that did nothing to stop the burning. My mother held her down while my grandmother did the pressing, saying it was for her own good, to keep the men away, to let her finish school, to protect her from early pregnancy. But even at 11, I could see the tears streaming down my mother's face as she pinned her own daughter to the mat. The other girls in our compound whispered about it in the dark. Some said if you drank certain herbs, your chest would stay flat longer. Others said sleeping on your stomach helped. But we all knew eventually our turn would come. My best friend Essie had already been through it twice because hers kept growing back. Her mother said she was stubborn, even in her body. I started wearing my father's old shirts, 3 sizes too big, binding myself with strips of cloth I tore from old dresses, anything to hide what was happening to my body. I hunched my shoulders forward when I walked, avoided running or jumping, stopped playing football with the boys because movement made it obvious. Every morning I checked, hoping nothing had changed overnight, but bodies don't listen to hope. By 12, it was getting harder to hide. My grandmother started watching me differently, measuring me with her eyes. One morning she grabbed my arm while I was washing dishes. "Tomorrow," she said, "we'll take care of you before it gets worse, before the men start noticing." That night I couldn't sleep. The next morning I pretended to be sick. Violent stomach pains, doubling over, moaning. But my grandmother wasn't fooled. She'd seen every trick, she said, heating the stone while my mother looked away. I tried to run, but where could I go? In a compound surrounded by family? The first press is something you never forget. The smell of burning flesh mixed with shea butter. The sound that comes from your throat that you didn't know you could make. The way your vision goes white, then black, then white again. They did one side, then the other, methodically, like they were ironing clothes. My mother held my hands, whispering that I was brave, that it would be over soon, that one day I'd understand. For weeks I couldn't lift my arms, couldn't lie on my stomach or back, could barely breathe without pain. The wounds wept clear fluid that stuck to my clothes. My grandmother applied honey and herbs twice a day, checking for infection, proud of her work. "See," she said to my mother, "flat as a boy now. She'll be safe." But 3 months later, they started growing again, like my body was fighting back, refusing to be suppressed. My grandmother was furious, said I was eating too much meat, drinking too much milk, inviting trouble. She scheduled another session, this time with the wooden pestle used for pounding yam, heated until it steamed. The second time was worse because I knew what was coming. That's when I met Ms. Akosua, the new health teacher at our school. She was from the capital and wore suits and had studied abroad. During a lesson about puberty, she mentioned something that made my heart stop. "In some places," she said, "people hurt girls' bodies to try to control them, but your body belongs to you alone." After class, I lingered. "Do you know about the flattening?" I whispered. She looked at me for a long moment, then closed the classroom door. "Sit," she said. "Tell me everything." I told her about the stones, the pestle, the pain, my grandmother's pride, my mother's tears, how it was happening to every girl I knew, how some were flattened 6, 7, 8 times until their chests were forever scarred. She showed me articles on her phone, words I'd never seen before: child abuse, medical complications, tissue damage, infection. She showed me pictures of grown women whose chests never developed properly because of repeated ironing, women who couldn't breastfeed their babies, women with tumors and cysts. She said in the city it was becoming illegal, that organizations were fighting it. "But this is tradition," I said. "This is protection." "Protection from what?" she asked. "Protection that requires torturing children is not protection. It's just torture wrapped in fear." She gave me pamphlets to hide, information about laws being proposed, phone numbers for organizations that helped girls. She said change starts with understanding, with one girl telling another. The next morning, as my grandmother heated the stones, a car pulled up. Health officials with papers, with authority. My grandmother tried to resist, but they knew the law, knew their rights. They examined me, documented the scars, took statements. And that's when everything changed. Not just for me, but for our whole compound. The health officials moved through our compound like they owned it, their white coats making them look like ghosts against our red dirt walls. Dr. Mensa, the one in charge, had me sit on a plastic chair they brought while a woman with gloves started taking pictures of my chest. Click, click, click went her camera while grandmother stood in the doorway screaming that they were devils sent to destroy our traditions, that city people didn't understand how to protect young girls, that we'd all end up pregnant before 15 without the flattening. Mother just stood there between us, her whole body shaking as she held the papers Dr. Mensa gave her, trying to read words she didn't understand while the pen trembled in her hand. The camera woman measured each scar with a ruler, writing numbers in her notebook, asking me to turn this way and that while neighbors gathered outside our gate to watch. Dr. Mensa explained they needed to check the other girls too, that this was bigger than just me. But when his team walked toward the other houses, mothers grabbed their daughters and pulled them inside, doors slamming one after another like dominoes falling. Only Essie stayed visible, standing behind her mother's wrapper, her hand pressed against her own chest where I knew her scars were hiding under her dress. Her eyes met mine across the compound, and I saw her fingers trace the raised lines through the fabric. Ms. Akosua appeared at my side then, keys jingling in her hand, saying we needed to go to the hospital for proper treatment. treatment. That infection could set in if we didn't clean the wounds correctly. I climbed into her car, a blue Toyota that smelled like air freshener and leather, so different from the Trotros I usually rode in. Through the back window, I watched my compound get smaller and smaller. Grandmother still shouting from the doorway, mother standing frozen with those papers in her hand, neighbors whispering behind their hands. The hospital was bigger than any building I'd seen, all white tiles and bright lights that hurt my eyes. The nurse there was gentle, her fingers soft as she touched each scar, measuring how wide, how deep, asking when each one happened while she wrote everything down. I counted on my fingers for her. First time 3 months ago when grandmother used the hot stone, second time last week with the wooden pestle. She took more pictures, different angles, close-ups that showed every detail, saying these would be evidence for the case file. The antiseptic she used stung worse than shea butter, but she said it would prevent infection, that some girls came in with wounds that wouldn't heal for months. I sat in the waiting room afterward, the plastic chairs cold against my legs. When mother appeared carrying my school bag and extra clothes stuffed in a Ghana must-go bag, she wouldn't look at me, just stared at the floor while she whispered that they said I might need to stay somewhere safe for a few days. I understood what she meant. Away from grandmother, away from the compound, away from the hot stones waiting in our kitchen. The social worker, a woman with glasses and a kind smile, sat us down in a small office and explained that I'd be staying with Ms. Akosua temporarily while they investigated. That grandmother couldn't be alone with me until the case review happened. Mother nodded, but I could see her mind working, trying to figure out how she'd explain this to the family, to the neighbors, to grandmother who ruled our compound like a queen. That night I lay in Ms. Akosua's spare bedroom, on a real bed with springs that squeaked when I moved, staring at her walls covered with posters of women in white coats, women flying planes, women in judges' robes. She brought me hot chocolate in a blue mug, something I'd only seen on TV, and the sweetness made my tongue tingle. Everything felt strange and new and impossible, like I'd stepped through a door into someone else's life. The next morning, I woke to find my school uniform hanging on the door, washed and pressed with crisp lines. Ms. Akosua set breakfast on the table, bread with jam, not the usual kenki, and said firmly that I wasn't missing classes because of this, that my education mattered more than what people might say. But my stomach churned thinking about facing everyone when the whole compound knew what happened, when their mothers had seen the health officials at our gate. Walking through the school gates felt like walking through fire, whispers following me down every corridor, eyes tracking my movement like I had a sign on my forehead. Some girls pressed against the walls when I passed, fear making their faces tight, while others watched with something that might have been hope flickering in their eyes. How does a whole community keep believing something so painful is protection? The way grandmother calls the health officials devils, while she's literally heating stones to burn children, makes me wonder how traditions get so twisted that hurting becomes caring in people's minds. During assembly, Isi found me, grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard her nails dug into my palm. Her lips barely moved when she whispered that my grandmother was organizing a meeting, gathering the compound mothers to fight back against the city people who didn't understand our ways. After school, I walked out to find 3 mothers waiting by the gate, Mama Afua standing in front like a general ready for war. She spat on the ground near my feet, her voice loud enough for everyone to hear when she said I'd brought shame on all of us, teaching these city people our private business, putting every girl in danger because now they'd come for all our daughters. Before I could even step back, Ms. Akosua pushed through the crowd of girls who'd gathered to watch, her teaching bag swinging at her side as she planted herself between me and the mothers. She didn't raise her voice, just stood there with her arms crossed, looking at each woman in turn before saying that any harassment of a child under her protection would be reported directly to the police station down the road. Mama Afua's face twisted like she'd bitten into something sour, but she stepped back, pulling the other mothers with her, their angry whispers following us as Ms. Akosua walked me to her car. That evening, while I sat at Ms. Akosua's small kitchen table doing homework, someone knocked on her apartment door, and when she opened it, my mother stood there holding a covered pot that smelled like my favorite jollof rice with extra pepper and spices. She came in quietly, setting the pot on the counter before sitting across from me, her hands shaking slightly as she admitted that grandmother wouldn't speak to her anymore, said she'd failed as a mother by letting outsiders interfere with family business. Her voice cracked when she said it, and I saw her wipe her eyes quickly before standing to leave. 3 days later at school during morning break, I was sitting under the mango tree when 2 younger girls from primary 4 walked up to me, looking around nervously before the smaller one lifted her school shirt just enough to show fresh wounds across her chest, the skin still raw and weeping. "Does it stop?" she whispered, and I didn't know if she meant the pain or if people would keep doing this to girls like us. That afternoon, Dr. Mensah's white van pulled up to our compound again, but this time 3 more vehicles followed, filled with nurses in blue uniforms, social workers with clipboards, and 2 police officers who stood by the entrance. They had official papers, a warrant that let them examine all girls under 16, and mothers started grabbing their daughters, trying to hide them in back rooms, but the officers made it clear the law was the law now. One by one, they called the girls into the community center they'd set up with white sheets for privacy, and I could hear crying from inside as nurses documented what they found. By the time the sun started setting, they'd examined 17 girls, and the lead nurse came out with tears in her eyes, telling Dr. Mensah that some had infections that needed immediate treatment, others had tissue damage that might never heal properly, and the youngest was only 9 years old. Officials took photos, wrote everything down in their big books, while mothers wept and grandmothers shouted about tradition being destroyed by city people who didn't understand our ways. The next morning, the district assembly called an emergency meeting in the big hall near the market, and Ms. Akosua picked me up early so I could witness what happened when leaders had to face the truth. The room split like oil and water, with health officials on one side showing slides of medical damage, infection rates, and long-term complications, while traditional leaders on the other side argued about culture, protection, and the right way to raise daughters. That evening, I was reading at Ms. Akosua's apartment when I heard scratching at the window, and there was Isi, climbing through like we used to do at each other's houses before everything changed. She sat on the bed, pulling her knees to her chest, and told me her mother wanted to send her to her aunt in the village, thinking she'd be safe from the city people there. We held hands in the dark, both of us knowing what really happened in villages, how the practice was even stronger where no officials ever came to check. The next morning, Ms. Akosua spread papers across her living room floor, statistics about thousands of girls across the country going through the same thing, and I helped her organize them into presentations for other schools. While she explained that knowledge was how we fought this, I thought about all the girls who didn't have a Ms. Akosua, who had no one to show them those papers or tell them their bodies weren't meant to be burned. At school, the headmaster called a special assembly about body safety, but by the time we lined up, I noticed empty spaces everywhere, and my class had shrunk from 40 students to 25 because parents were pulling their daughters out in protest. Education became another casualty of tradition, another price girls paid for being born female. Then on the 6th day, just as morning lessons started, grandmother appeared at the school gate with 5 elders from our compound, all of them in their best clothes like they were going to court, demanding I return home because this was family business that didn't concern outsiders. The headmaster started to waver, looking between them and Ms. Akosua, until she pulled out an official protection order with the government seal stamped in red, and I'll never forget grandmother's face when she saw it, like the world she knew had just cracked open. The compound went quiet after that, everyone staring at the paper like it might burst into flames, and the health officials started moving, one of them putting her hand on my shoulder, while another stepped between me and grandmother, who kept opening and closing her mouth without any words coming out. They led me to their van, Ms. Akosua following close behind, and I watched through the back window as grandmother stood frozen in the doorway, getting smaller and smaller until we turned the corner. The next few days blurred together in a mess of medical exams and photographs and questions asked over and over by different people in different offices, each one writing down my answers in thick folders that got passed from desk to desk. They took pictures of my scars under bright lights, measured them with rulers, asked me to rate the pain on scales from 1 to 10, and through it all, Ms. Akosua sat beside me, her hand on my back whenever I started shaking. On the 7th day, they drove us to the courthouse in the city center, a big white building with columns that made my stomach flip just looking at it, and inside the halls echoed with footsteps and voices bouncing off marble floors. The courtroom smelled like old wood and floor polish, with rows of benches like church pews and a raised platform where the magistrate sat, a woman with gray streaks in her hair and kind eyes behind wire glasses who looked right at me when I walked in. My legs felt like water as they led me to a chair facing her, and I could hear mother somewhere behind me, her breathing sharp and quick like she'd been running. The magistrate asked me to tell her what happened, her voice soft but clear, and I started talking, the words coming out jumbled at first about the stones and the fire and the smell of burning skin, how they held me down, how grandmother said it was for my own good, how it happened twice when my body wouldn't stay flat. My voice cracked when I described the pain, how it felt like my whole chest was being crushed and burned at the same time, how I couldn't sleep for weeks without crying, and behind me I heard mother make a sound like someone had punched her in the stomach. The magistrate wrote everything down, asking gentle questions when I got confused or mixed up the order of things, never rushing me even when I had to stop to wipe my face. When it was over, she thanked me for being brave and said they would make sure I was safe. Then the bailiff led me out through a side door while mother stayed behind for her own testimony. I found the bathroom down the hall and splashed cold water on my face, trying to stop my hands from shaking, when the door opened and mother came in, her face puffy and red. She looked at me in the mirror for a long moment before the words started spilling out, how she wanted to protect me but was too afraid of grandmother, of the family, of what people would say if she went against tradition. And then she was holding me and we were both shaking, her tears soaking into my hair. The next morning at school felt different, like everyone knew where I'd been. And during lunch, I noticed a girl from the younger class had bruises on her arms, purple marks peeking out from under her uniform sleeves. When I asked if she was okay, she pulled away, wrapping her arms around herself, and said not everyone had a teacher from the city to save them, her eyes hard and angry in a way that made my chest tight. I wanted to tell her about the protection order, about the magistrate with kind eyes, but she was already walking away, and I realized how many other girls were still waking up to heated stones. The day after that, Dr. Mensa showed up at school with a whole team, setting up a health screening in the nurse's office that parents couldn't object to since it was just a general checkup, but we all knew what they were really looking for. One by one, girls went in and came out, some looking relieved, others with faces tight with worry, and by the end of the day, they'd found 7 more with signs of breast ironing, burn scars, and flattened tissue that told the same story as mine. That evening, I was helping Ms. Akosua cook dinner in her apartment when we heard the crash, glass exploding inward as stones flew through the windows, and we dropped to the floor as more rocks followed, shattering the living room windows one by one. Wait, the mothers formed a whole mob at the school gate? That's wild how they organized so fast to confront her for telling the truth. What makes Ms. Akosua brave enough to stand up to all those angry women when everyone else seems too scared? We crawled to the bedroom and huddled against the far wall while glass fell like rain, the message clear as day that we needed to stop interfering or face worse. And Ms. Akosua called the police with shaking hands while I pressed myself into the corner trying to disappear. The police came fast, their sirens cutting through the night, and suddenly the apartment was full of uniforms taking pictures of the damage, collecting the stones in evidence bags, asking us over and over if we saw who did it. The next day, they increased patrols around the apartment and school, police cars circling the block every hour, and the inspector, a tall man with a serious face, took our statements about the attack and said this escalation changed things, that criminal charges might follow now that there was violence involved. That evening, Ms. Akosua taught me to make pasta, something she learned during her time studying abroad, showing me how to test if it was ready by throwing a piece at the wall to see if it stuck. While we cooked, she talked about how fear was their weapon, but we had something stronger, the law and each other, stirring the pot with steady hands, even though I could see the worry in her eyes. That night, I dreamed about the stones again, not the ones through the window, but the ones they heated for my chest, and I woke up at 3 in the morning soaked in sweat, my heart racing like I'd been running. Ms. Akosua found me on the balcony breathing in the cool night air, and without saying anything, she made us tea, and we sat watching the city sleep, the lights twinkling below us like stars, both of us knowing some wounds don't show up in photographs. 2 days later, a journalist from the Capitol showed up with a camera and notebook, walking through our compound asking questions, and I watched from Ms. Akosua's window as mothers locked their doors when she passed, pulling their daughters inside. The divide was getting deeper every day between those who wanted change and those who held tight to tradition, neighbors who used to share meals now crossing the street to avoid each other, and that same afternoon, Mama organized a counter meeting at the community center. I heard later that 50 women showed up, filling the room with angry voices calling for the health officials to leave our community alone, Mama preaching from the front that outsiders wanted to destroy our culture and turn our daughters into prostitutes who would bring shame to their families. But the district health director wasn't backing down, and 2 days later he stood in front of cameras at the regional hospital, announcing that every single case of breast ironing in our district would be investigated, that all health workers had to report any signs of it, and that traditional leaders who tried to block the investigation would face charges themselves. The traditional chiefs went crazy when they heard this, threatening to pull their support from the ruling party if the government kept attacking our customs. And suddenly what started as me running to a teacher became this huge political fight that had everyone taking sides. The next morning, Adana showed up at the safe house where I was staying, my sister looking way older than her 15 years with dark circles under her eyes and her shoulders hunched forward like she was still trying to hide. She sat next to me on the bed and took my hand, squeezing it tight before pulling up her shirt to show me the scars across her chest, thick raised lines that crisscrossed worse than mine because grandmother had done it to her 5 times before giving up. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, her voice shaking as she traced one of the scars with her finger. "Maybe my daughters won't have to hide like we did." We sat there holding each other while she told me how the compound had split into 2 camps, some supporting grandmother and others quietly saying maybe it was time for change, though nobody dared say it too loud. That same week, 3 mothers approached Ms. Akosua after school, waiting until all the other teachers had left before knocking on her classroom door, their eyes darting around like they were doing something illegal. They wanted help, but were terrified of what would happen if their husbands or the community elders found out they were questioning tradition. So Ms. Akosua started organizing secret meetings at her house, where mothers could talk about their fears and learn about the law. I went back to the compound 4 days later with 2 police officers beside me, needing to get more of my clothes and school books, and everything looked smaller somehow, like the place had shrunk while I was gone. Grandmother stood in her doorway watching us, her face like stone, not moving or speaking even when I walked past her to get to my room, and the silence felt heavier than any shouting match we'd ever had. The other kids in the compound stared at me like I was a stranger, some with curiosity and others with something that looked like fear, probably because their parents had told them I was trouble now. During one of the secret mothers' meetings the following evening, everything went wrong when someone's husband burst through Ms. Akosua's door shouting about traitors selling our culture to outsiders, his face twisted with rage as he pointed at each woman there. The mothers scattered like startled birds, some running out the back door while others tried to explain they were just having tea, but he kept yelling about how they were destroying everything our ancestors built. And I realized then that change came with a price not everyone could afford to pay. The second court hearing happened 3 days after that, with the magistrate ordering medical exams for every girl in our compound, while grandmother's lawyer argued about cultural rights and traditional practices that had existed for generations. The magistrate cut him off, saying culture couldn't be used as an excuse to hurt children, that safety came before tradition, and that the exams would happen whether the families agreed or not. Mother showed up at the safe house the next evening with my math and science textbooks, staying to help me with homework even though she looked exhausted from fighting with the family all day. "They barely speak to me now," she admitted while we worked through equations, her hand shaking slightly as she wrote, "But seeing you strong like this, maybe it's worth losing them if it means you get to keep yourself." We spent 2 hours going through my assignments, both of us pretending this was normal, like we used to do before everything exploded, slowly rebuilding something between us that had been broken by those hot stones. Then Ms. Akosua got hit with a transfer notice ordering her to report to some rural school 300 kilometers away, obviously someone's attempt to get rid of the troublemaker who had started all this by listening to a scared girl. She fought it hard, filing complaints and calling the teachers' union, but the pressure was real, and I could see the worry in her eyes even as she promised me she wouldn't leave until this was finished. I started teaching other girls in our class about their rights during lunch breaks, showing them the pamphlets Ms. Akosua had given me, watching as some grabbed them eagerly while others refused to even touch them, scared of what knowing might cost them. The knowledge spread slowly through whispers and secret conversations, but fear moved faster, especially after word got out about the transfer notice and what happened to women who spoke up. Everything got worse when Essie's mother decided to send her away to live with relatives in the village, keeping the promise she'd made about removing her daughter from the corrupting influence of the city and its dangerous ideas. I watched the taxi pull away with my best friend's face pressed against the back window, her eyes wide with fear and betrayal, and I wondered how many other girls would disappear like this, sent away to maintain the silence that kept the stones hot and the tradition alive. 3 weeks later at the health ministry office in town, the director stood in front of a room packed with nurses and doctors from across the district, explaining the new rules that would change everything. Every health worker who found signs of breast ironing had to report it now, no exceptions. And the training session showed them exactly what to look for: the burn patterns, the tissue damage, the infections that came after. I watched from the hallway through a crack in the door where Ms. Akosua had brought me to see history being made, my own scars hidden under my school uniform, but burning with memory. The next morning, my mother showed up at Ms. Akosua's apartment with an envelope, her hands shaking as she handed it over, and inside was my grandmother's handwriting on paper, torn from an old exercise book. The words cut deeper than any heated stone ever could, saying I'd destroyed our family, brought shame on our ancestors, turned my back on everything that protected us for generations. But at the very bottom, in smaller letters, she wrote that she missed me, that the compound felt empty without my voice. My mother stood there crying while I read it 3 times, trying to understand how someone could love you and hurt you in the same breath, how tradition could matter more than the pain it caused. That afternoon, a teacher from a school 2 districts over called Ms. Akosua's phone, speaking in whispers about girls in her class who needed help, who came to school with bandages under their uniforms, who flinched when anyone got too close. The network was growing quietly, teacher to teacher, school to school, each conversation another crack in the wall of silence that had protected this practice for so long. Ms. Akosua gave me a notebook that night, one with a lock and key, telling me to write everything down, every memory, every detail, because my story could help other girls understand they weren't alone. The pasta sticking to the wall test is such a simple moment of normal life breaking through all this chaos. I wonder if Ms. Akosua chose that specific lesson to remind them both that regular life still exists beyond the fear, writing hurt in a different way than the stones had, each word bringing back the smell of burning flesh, the sound of my own screams, the feeling of betrayal when the people who were supposed to protect me held me down instead. 4 days into keeping the journal, everything exploded when the journalist who'd been investigating our case published her article in the biggest newspaper in the country with the headline, "The Village Where Tradition Scars," spread across the front page. My compound's name was right there for everyone to see, along with statistics about how many girls went through this, medical reports about the damage it caused, quotes from doctors calling it torture. Within hours, reporters from every news station in the capital were calling the health ministry, wanting interviews, wanting to visit our village, wanting to put faces to the story that was suddenly on everyone's lips. The next morning, a convoy of government cars rolled into our compound, dust flying everywhere as officials from the Ministry of Gender Affairs stepped out with cameras and clipboards, saying they needed to see the evidence firsthand, needed to document everything for their investigation. Privacy became something we used to have as reporters followed the officials, taking pictures of our homes, our cooking areas, the very stones that had been heated on our fires. Ms. Akosua kept me away from the cameras, but I watched from her apartment window as my grandmother faced down a government minister, her chin high even as her world crumbled around her. That night, exactly 1 month since I'd run to Ms. Akosua for help, I stood in front of her mirror without the binding cloths I'd worn for so long, letting my body exist without apology for the first time in years. The freedom felt strange and scary and wonderful all at once, like learning to breathe again after holding your breath underwater. The investigation kept expanding as 5 more girls from schools across the district came forward with their own stories, each one different but the same. Stories of hot stones and wooden pestles and grinding stones, all the tools our grandmothers had turned into weapons against our bodies. The health officials worked overtime documenting each case, taking photographs of scars, recording testimonies, building a mountain of evidence that couldn't be ignored or explained away as tradition. My mother came to Ms. Akosua's apartment 2 days later with her face drawn and tired, telling me she'd lost her job at the market because the vendor association said she brought shame to their group by letting her daughter speak out against their customs. Watching her face as she tried to stay strong for me while her world fell apart was worse than any physical pain I'd endured, knowing that speaking the truth had cost her everything she'd worked for. The community leaders called a press conference the next day, gathering in the chief's compound to denounce the investigation as an attack on our culture by outsiders who didn't understand our ways. But then something unexpected happened when one elder, an old man whose granddaughter had nearly died from infection after her 3rd flattening, stood up and said maybe it was time to question traditions that left children scarred and damaged. The crack in their unified front was small, but it was there. And in that moment, I understood that change wasn't just about laws and investigations, but about people brave enough to say that love shouldn't require suffering, that protection shouldn't leave scars, that tradition wasn't sacred when it came at the cost of children's bodies and futures. 3 days later, the news showed parliament members arguing about breast ironing on TV. Some said education was enough, others wanted jail time for anyone who did it. Mother watched from Ms. Akosua's tiny living room while I did homework at the kitchen table. The next morning, Adana showed up with 2 plastic bags of clothes because Mother couldn't pay rent alone anymore. We squeezed into the single bed that night, her on one side, me on the other, Mother in the middle like when we were little, except now we whispered about finding jobs and saving money instead of fairy tales. Back at the compound, I heard later, traditional healers had arrived claiming all the sick girls were being punished for abandoning their culture. They burned herbs and chanted over the houses where girls had been taken to the hospital. Some mothers started doubting themselves, wondering if maybe they'd brought curses on their daughters by cooperating with the investigation. When I went back to school 2 days later, my desk had been moved to the back corner. Kids I'd known since we were 6 turned away when I walked past. The teacher pretended not to notice when nobody wanted to be my lab lab partner in science class. At lunch, I sat alone, watching groups of students whisper and point. One girl said her mother told her not to talk to me because I was the one who brought shame to our community. That afternoon, Dr. Mensah stood before the district assembly with a laptop and projector. The photos made assembly members look away. Infected wounds, surgical scars, tissue damage that would never heal properly. 43 confirmed cases just in our district, he said. 12 requiring immediate surgery, 3 with permanent damage. The evidence was undeniable, but nobody wanted to see it. The next day, the court ordered my grandmother and 11 other women to attend mandatory education sessions about child development and human rights. They had to go every week for 3 months or face contempt charges. My grandmother's friends said it was humiliation, being taught like school children about things they'd done for generations. Ms. Akosua got a letter saying her transfer request had been approved, that she'd be sent to a rural school up north. But after the newspapers picked up the story and parents started protesting, the education ministry reversed the decision. She cried that evening while cooking rice, said it was the first time in weeks she'd felt like maybe things could change. Mother found out about a group of women meeting secretly at different houses. They were all mothers who'd refused to iron their daughters or who regretted doing it. 12 of them now, sharing stories and planning how to protect the younger girls. They met at night after their husbands slept, speaking in whispers about resistance and change. I helped Mother fill out job applications at the internet cafe, typing while she dictated her work history. Her hands shook less now when signing her name at the bottom. We didn't talk about grandmother or going back to the compound. Some things broke too badly to fix. Then the news came from the next village. A 10-year-old girl dead from infection after her mother used a heated spoon. The funeral turned into a battlefield between those calling it murder and those calling it tradition. The girl's father wanted to press charges, but the elders said it would destroy their community. Her mother just sat there crying, holding her daughter's school uniform, saying she only wanted to protect her. The next morning, government trucks rolled into our compound with medical teams wearing white coats and carrying equipment I'd never seen before. They set up tents near the market square and started examining every girl under 18, documenting scars, taking photos, asking questions about who did what and when. Some mothers tried to hide their daughters, but the officials had lists from the schools, knew exactly who to look for. The nurses were gentle but thorough, measuring the damage, categorizing it by severity, 1 through 5, with 5 being the worst cases that needed immediate treatment. They found 3 girls with active infections who got loaded into ambulances right away, their mothers crying and trying to climb in after them but being held back by security. The lead doctor kept shaking his head as he filled out forms, muttering about how many cases they were finding, how the government couldn't ignore this anymore. 2 days later, Ms. Akosua asked me to speak at the school assembly about body safety, said my voice could help other girls understand their rights. My hands shook as I stood in front of 200 students, but I told them about the stones, about the pain, about how tradition wasn't always right just because it was old. I explained what the health officials taught us about infections and permanent damage, how some women couldn't feed their babies later because of what was done to them as girls. When I finished, the hall was so quiet you could hear the ceiling fans creaking. Then 3 girls stayed behind after everyone left, pulling me aside near the water fountain to whisper their own stories, showing me scars hidden under their uniforms, asking if the medical teams could help them too. The next afternoon, my grandmother got summoned to attend an education session at the community center, part of her agreement to avoid prosecution. She sat in the back row with her arms crossed, glaring at the health educator who patiently explained with diagrams how breast tissue worked, what damage the ironing caused, why it didn't actually prevent anything it claimed to prevent. The educator showed statistics from other regions where the practice had stopped, how teen pregnancy rates stayed the same or even dropped when girls got proper education instead of torture. I watched my grandmother's face shift from anger to confusion, to something that might have been doubt, though she'd never admit it. Later that week, Ms. Akosua kept me after class and spread university brochures across her desk, pointing at programs for law, medicine, social work, saying this fight needed educated women who understood both worlds, who could speak to both the elders and the government. She helped me fill out applications, explaining scholarships and entrance exams, showing me a future I'd never imagined possible, where I could leave the compound but come back with power to create real change. The university brochures spreading across that desk make me wonder if Ms. Akosua planned this all along. Did she see potential in her student from the very beginning? The thought made my chest tight with both fear and hope. Then the male elders called an emergency meeting with the health officials, demanding that women's issues be handled by women only, that men from the capital had no business interfering in their traditions. Dr. Mensah stood his ground in the meeting hall, reminding them that children's rights transcended gender boundaries, that the law didn't care about their comfort when girls were dying. One elder pounded his walking stick and stormed out, but others stayed, listening as the doctor explained the new laws being drafted, the penalties for anyone who continued the practice. The hospital started using a special code for breast ironing injuries, making it easier to track cases and mandatory for doctors to report them just like any other child abuse. Forms got distributed to every clinic with clear instructions, photos showing what to look for, phone numbers to call. Within days, reports started flooding in from rural areas where girls had been suffering in silence, afraid to seek help before. Each report meant another investigation, another family questioned, another tradition challenged by law and science. My mother surprised us all by getting a job at a shop owned by Ms. Akosua's friend, her first real income that didn't depend on my father or the family. She came home that first day with a small smile, counting her wages at the kitchen table, talking about saving for my school fees, maybe even buying her own sewing machine. It wasn't much money, but it was hers, earned honestly, and I saw her stand a little straighter when she walked through the compound. But not everyone supported the changes, and soon shops started refusing offering service to families who cooperated with the health officials, calling us traitors and Western puppets. The woman who sold vegetables turned her back when my mother approached. The man at the grain store said his supplies were finished whenever we came near. Others quietly slipped us extra portions when no one was looking, whispering that they agreed but couldn't say so publicly. Every purchase became a statement, every transaction a choice between tradition and progress. A letter arrived from Essie, smuggled out through a cousin who traveled between villages. She wrote in pencil on torn notebook paper about missing school, about other girls in her village still facing the stones, about how her mother kept her inside now, afraid the health officials would come for them next. She asked if the changes would ever reach her village, if she'd ever see a classroom again, and I folded the letter carefully, adding it to the growing pile of evidence Ms. Akosua was collecting. Then came the meeting that changed everything, when Mama Efua's own daughter stood up in the community hall and slowly lifted her shirt, revealing scars that crisscrossed her chest like a map of pain. She'd been ironed 7 times between ages 10 and 15, each time more brutal than the last, until there was barely any normal tissue left. Mama Efua's face crumbled as her daughter spoke about the infections, the fever dreams, the nights she thought she'd die while her mother held the stones, and suddenly the divide between tradition and protection became impossible to ignore. 3 weeks later, I sat in the courthouse watching the magistrate shuffle through papers, while my grandmother's lawyer argued that tradition wasn't abuse. The room was packed with women from our compound, some supporting us, others glaring like we'd betrayed everything they stood for. Dr. Mensah presented medical reports, photos of scars, testimonies from girls who couldn't breastfeed their babies years later. The magistrate kept adjusting his glasses, looking between the evidence and my grandmother, who sat straight-backed in her best kente cloth. When he finally spoke, his voice carried through the silent room. "Child abuse," he said. "The practice constitutes child abuse under national law." My grandmother's lawyer jumped up immediately, papers already prepared for appeal, but something had shifted in that room. The next morning, Adana enrolled in a sewing program at the vocational center downtown. She spread fabric samples across our bedroom floor, measuring and cutting with new scissors that caught the light. We studied together in the evenings, her practicing stitches while I worked through math problems, both of us building futures our scars couldn't touch. The radio stations picked up the story, and suddenly everyone had opinions. I heard our case discussed on 3 different programs while walking to school, callers arguing about tradition versus progress, some women calling in to share their own stories of being ironed 5, 6, 7 times. The hospital started group therapy sessions, and my mother signed me up without asking. I sat in a circle with 8 other girls, none of us talking much at first, just existing in the same space with our shared understanding. The therapist, a woman from Accra with gentle hands, didn't push us to speak. Sometimes we drew pictures instead of talking. Sometimes we just sat. One girl showed us keloid scars that covered her entire chest. Another couldn't stop scratching at phantom pains. Ms. Akosua found a note slipped under her door one morning, the writing angry and slanted. "Stop corrupting our daughters," it said. "Stop destroying our culture." She showed it to the police, who increased patrols near her house. But we all knew threats didn't always come with warnings. She started varying her route to school, checking her car before getting in, looking over her shoulder more. The fear sat heavy on all of us. The Ministry of Gender announced new funding for survivor support programs at a press conference I watched on the old TV at school. They promised counseling services, medical treatment for complications, educational support for girls who'd missed school during recovery. Money moved slowly through government channels, but at least it was moving. 2 months had passed since the health officials first came to our compound, and I found myself measuring everything as before and after. Before, when I hunched my shoulders and wore oversized shirts. After, when I could stand straight without fear. Before, when silence protected tradition. After, when speaking became survival. Time felt different now, each day of freedom worth a month of the old life. At school, younger girls started approaching me with questions. "Why do they do it?" they asked. "Does it really prevent pregnancy like our mothers say?" I answered carefully, remembering Ms. Akosua's words about education replacing mythology. One girl, maybe 9 years old, whispered that her mother was planning to iron her soon. I gave her the phone numbers, told her about the law, watched hope and fear battle in her eyes. My mother saw grandmother at the market on a Tuesday morning, both reaching for the same bunch of plantains. They didn't speak, but my mother said they nodded, a small acknowledgement that meant everything and nothing. Families break in big moments and heal in small ones, she told me later, peeling those same plantains for dinner. The announcement came over the radio during morning assembly, a national conference on harmful traditional practices, with our case as a primary example. Suddenly, reporters wanted interviews. NGOs wanted us to speak at events. Everyone wanted to make us symbols of change. The weight of representing more than just ourselves pressed down like those hot stones once had, but this time we could choose whether to carry it. Legal aid lawyers started showing up at the compound the next week, setting up makeshift offices under the mango trees with folding tables and boxes of paperwork. They took statements from every girl who wanted to speak, writing everything down in careful handwriting while mothers stood behind their daughters with hands on their shoulders. The lawyers worked for free, said justice shouldn't cost money, and more families started coming forward each day. I spent hours helping them organize files, translating between English and our local dialect when needed, watching as the stack of cases grew taller. Ms. Akosua asked if I wanted to help train other girls to speak in their communities, and my hands shook when I said yes, but my voice stayed steady. We practiced in her living room, me standing in front of 5 other girls from different compounds, teaching them the words I'd learned about rights and laws and bodies that belonged to us. The compound elders called a meeting without the traditionalists, just the families who wanted change, and 15 households showed up with their daughters. They drafted a letter to the district assembly supporting the ban, signing their names one by one while the older women women watched from their doorways. I went back to visit the compound clinic where the nurse now checked girls quietly during regular visits, looking for signs of harm, documenting everything in her records. She nodded at me when I walked in, this woman who'd been there all along but only now could act. The radio crackled with news that made everyone stop what they were doing. Parliament was voting on the breast ironing ban that afternoon. We crowded around the old radio in the compound square, listening as they announced each vote, and when it passed by just 7 votes, some women cheered while others turned away angry. The law changed, but hearts took longer. Implementation guidelines came out the next day, focusing on education before prosecution, giving communities 6 months to comply, trying to balance justice with understanding. My grandmother showed up at Ms. Akosua's apartment 3 days later, sitting stiff in the plastic chair, not looking at me directly while she sipped the tea we offered. "The world changes too fast," she said, but she came, and that meant something. Training sessions for compound women started that week in the community center, some dragging their feet, others rushing to get front row seats. How did that 9-year-old girl find the courage to whisper about her mother's plans? The way she trusted enough to ask for help shows how much these conversations are shifting everything in their community. The health workers explained the damage, showed pictures, answered questions, and slowly knowledge spread through whispers and conversations over cooking fires. Dr. Mensah held a press conference announcing that prosecution would proceed for the most severe cases, 3 women already facing charges, but my grandmother wasn't among them because she'd cooperated with the investigation. The final court hearing was set for tomorrow, where the magistrate would decide on custody and protection orders, and my mother held my hand so tight it hurt as we sat in Ms. Akosua's apartment going over what would happen. The magistrate was an older woman with gray hair who looked at me like she actually saw me, not just another case file, and when she asked if I felt safe returning home, I nodded because my mother had already moved us to a different part of the compound where the women who supported us lived. The ruling came down hard and fast. My mother got full custody, regular health checks would happen every month at the clinic, and my grandmother couldn't be alone with me, but they didn't cut her off completely because the magistrate said families need time to heal. Walking out of that courthouse felt like floating, my mother crying happy tears while Ms. Akosua squeezed my shoulder, and the next day we started packing up the small room I'd been staying in at her apartment. She pressed books into my hands, old textbooks she'd used in university, notebooks filled with her neat handwriting about women's rights and health education, and when she said I'd started something bigger than us, I felt the weight of those words settle into my chest like a promise. The drive back to the compound took forever, my stomach doing flips as we passed familiar shops and streets, and when we pulled up, some neighbors came out to greet us while others turned their backs and went inside. Our new place was smaller, just 2 rooms instead of 4, but my mother had already installed new locks on both doors and painted the walls bright yellow like sunshine, and that first night I barely slept, jumping at every sound, until Adana crawled into my bed and held my hand without saying anything. Morning came with its own rhythm, getting dressed for school without hiding my body, walking to class with my head up, staying after for the new advocacy group Ms. Akosua had helped start where we learned about our rights and how to share them safely. Girls started finding me during lunch, pulling me aside behind the cafeteria to whisper questions, and I'd slip them Ms. Akosua's phone number written on tiny pieces of paper, telling them about the law, about protection, about choices their grandmothers never had. My mother turned our front room into a tailoring shop, her old sewing machine humming from dawn to dusk, and women would come for alterations but stay for tea, their voices dropping low as they asked about what happened to us, about their own daughters, about tradition versus safety. 3 days after we'd been home, I saw my grandmother at the market buying tomatoes, and we both froze until she walked over slowly and said I looked healthy, not an apology but something, and I nodded before walking away because some bridges take time to rebuild. Ms. Akosua visited every week with more books, sitting at our kitchen table going over math problems and essay writing, telling me next year I'd be ready for university entrance exams if I kept working this hard, education becoming my new armor against anyone who thought they could control my future. The support group met in the basement of the health clinic every Tuesday, 8 of us ranging from 13 to 19, and even though I was the youngest, I was the only one whose case had gone public, had changed things. So when it was my turn to share, I talked about the burning and the healing and the fighting and the winning, watching their faces change from fear to something like hope. My scars were still there, raised lines across my chest that ached when it rained, but the shame had burned away in that courtroom, replaced by purpose that filled me up every time another girl took that slip of paper with the phone number, every time my mother's clients left with more than just hemmed skirts, every time I opened those university prep books and saw a future where our daughters would never know our pain, would never have to choose between their bodies and their education, would never learn that protection sometimes comes disguised as torture. And as I sat there in that circle of survivors, I knew we weren't just healing ourselves, but breaking a chain that had held too many girls for too long. Thanks for letting me explore and wonder right alongside you today. Seriously, it's been such a fascinating time. Catch you later. Subscribe for more content like this.